Hey everyone, welcome back for episode number 5 of the Pastor Dad podcast. This one is all about Christian nationalism. What you need to know about our nation's Christian heritage. Is that something that Christians just made up? And what's the deal with the term itself, Christian nationalism? Is that an insult to be avoided? Is that something that we should seek not to act in a way that we might be labeled that? So all that and more in this episode of the Pastor Dad podcast. Okay, so this episode was inspired by two questions I received. The first one was the United States founded on Christian values? It's something I grew up being taught, but in recent years I've heard people arguing that it's something that Christians just made up. I've started to do a little bit of research myself, but I have found conflicting answers. So that's the first question. We'll get into a little bit about the founding of our nation and actually go even back further than that to try to answer that question. But the second one is this, and related. I'm interested in Christian nationalism, which seems to be something that certain people are becoming concerned about. I've seen several books on the subject in the last few days, and of course, it seems like every couple of years we learn a whole set of new vocabulary words, and usually in the political sphere. But Christian nationalism certainly is one of the terms that are coming up. It's coming up a lot, both from Christians themselves and non-Christians, both in a positive way and probably more often in a negative way. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. But I want to start with the idea of the founding of our nation. And so is it the idea that our nation was founded on Christian principles, on Christian values? Is that the case, or is it indeed something that Christians have made up, something that was just convenient to say to try to win an argument? So to do that, as I mentioned, I want to go back pre-founding of our nation. And who was it that came over to the United States before they were the United States? And so you just think about a few different groups of people. First of all, the separatists or the Pilgrims. These are a group of people that came over in 1620 on the Mayflower, and they were of the mind that the Church of England was corrupt. It was so corrupt that it was beyond sort of redeeming. It was beyond fixing. And so they wanted to separate. That's how you get that name. They wanted to separate from the Church of England. And they very much were Christians, but they wanted to separate so that they could practice their faith in a non-broken. They thought it was, again, too corrupt, and they wanted to be able to celebrate and to practice their faith in the way that they saw fit. And so 1620 is sort of the period that marks their coming over here on the Mayflower. Secondly, the Puritans. Now, the Puritans were a group, just like their name suggests, that originally wanted to stay in England and purify the church. They saw the church as not so far gone that they couldn't be fixed. But it wasn't long after the Puritans or the Separatists came over that the Puritans followed suit in 1630, establishing the Massachusetts Bay Colony. What's interesting about their sort of way of doing things, they had a vision that you hear the city on a hill, and this was the idea that they had to be a Christian commonwealth, to be a theocratic society where Christianity was what sort of governed their daily and societal life. And then you have the Quakers in the mid 1600s. So all these groups in the early to mid 1600s coming over to what we now call the United States as colonists. And the Quakers were, as I was reading, and I didn't know this before, but the Quakers seem to have been persecuted by maybe even both groups, but they certainly endured some persecution. And so the early colonial experience was one that demonstrated that religion enforced by the state was going to result in persecution. And so as these early groups sort of interacted and had their conflicts, we see that this is setting the stage for understanding how badly this can go. We have next the Great Awakening revival in the 1730s and 1740s. So now we're creeping closer and closer to the official founding of our nation. And the Great Awakening was something that was characterized by the personal responsibility, the individual responsibility to God rather than a state's responsibility to enact a particular religion or enforce a particular religion upon its people. So you can see how in this milieu, in this sort of set the stage for what the founders would come to understand when they would frame the idea of religious liberty, very much as an idea of freedom of religion rather than a freedom from religion. In modern days, there's actually an organization, a 501c3, I believe, called the Freedom from Religion Foundation. As if that's religion is inherently evil and gives us nothing but problems. This is just not. It's foreign to the idea of the founding fathers that they were afraid of religion being present. They just thought it should not. No particular sect of Christianity should dictate or should dominate in the governmental sphere. Right, so it set the stage for how the founders. This all set the stage for how the founders would understand and frame religious liberty, and that brings us to just 30, 40 years later, 1776. Of course, the Declaration of Independence, and so you look at language in the Declaration of Independence. I'm going to read just a couple of citations of that. So there is a distinct theistic tone rather than a Christian, a particularly Christian one. But you read a couple of these things. So, laws of nature and nature's God is a section endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Appeals to the supreme judge of the world, and with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. So these are all very much theistic sort of, and the difference between theism and atheism is obvious, but the difference between theism and deism, which we'll get to in a second, is that theism believes in a God that is involved, and a God that cares about his creation, whereas deism, you might consider it something more along the lines of God was he was a creator in a sense, but just kind of made and then walked away. And so the theist believes much more in a God that actually is concerned about his creation and cares about his creation. So we see that sort of language and that sort of flavor in the Declaration of Independence. Now, when you come to a document like the Constitution, I think the Constitution is intentionally and specifically silent on these things. Why? Because again, we are looking not to recreate the problems of England and the Church of England. We are looking to protect the citizenry from that sort of thing, that sort of creep into one person's vision or a small group of people's vision of a theocratic society. And so in order to try to prevent that or to protect against that, the Constitution is intentionally vague. And the only substance there that you might look at that speaks to the religiosity of the group, perhaps the year of our Lord, 1787. But again, that was just a common way of expressing the date, which is inherently, the date itself is inherently, at least, tips its hat to the idea of Christianity being true, or at least being important. But this shows you the sentiment. Article 6, no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. So it ensured that one's faith or one's lack of faith couldn't be used to exclude somebody from civic participation. And that's important. And you look at the First Amendment, of course, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So the Constitution didn't reject religion; it protected it from coercion. It protected it from state control or from one particular variety of religion becoming dominant and dominating over those that didn't adhere to it. But so I think that provides undeniable sort of a case for the fact that the framers of our Constitution, the framers of founders of this nation, came to this out of a very much a people motivated by religious freedom and understanding that not just would they need to make that a thing, but it would need to be very carefully crafted because they were just living it, they were just experiencing it. So that I think is undeniable. But then we start coming to the quotes, and I honestly don't even know how people, I think the easiest argument to make about whether or not this is a Christian nation is to find deists quotes and use those. But to say that that's not to say that the nation wasn't founded on Christian principles. It just is to argue that it wasn't founded by Christians per se. Not all of the founders were Christians, but plenty of them were. Look at some of these quotes we have. John Adams, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." So there is an understanding by the founders that these documents, these principles are not adequate in and of themselves unless the people that these documents are to govern are a religious people, meaning that their morals, their morality, and their ethics come from something deeper than just founding documents. But John Adams is just one voice. There's other framers. You can look this up, and I verified all these quotes that I'm going to use. There's more that I had that I didn't verify, so I didn't want to put them in here. But I want to start with those that would consider themselves deists, because again, if you're going to make the argument that we are not founded on Christian principles, then you would start by quoting them. But you would look in vain for anybody that was specifically atheist. None of the founding fathers were atheist. Thomas Jefferson, well-known deist, and so not a Christian. He says, "And can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God, that they are not to be violated but with his wrath? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, and that his justice cannot sleep forever." Now that from Thomas Jefferson. Again, that's not a Christian quote, but it's a deistic quote that gives a nod to the belief in a creator and in a God as judge and a one who is just. So, and these are principles that would come from a Christian belief system. Then Benjamin Franklin. Also, I believe he was a deist. "I believe in one God, creator of the universe. The most acceptable service we rendered him is doing good to his other children." So again, another founder, another early American mind, giving a nod to not just a belief in gods in general, but belief in one God, creator of the universe. Thomas Paine is often thought of as an atheist. In fact, I thought he was an atheist, and I did some more digging. He was not. He rejected organized religion, and he had he wrote the book Age of Reason, and so he had his own thoughts and opinions on these things. But he said in one quote, "I believe," and it's a little bit longer quote, "I believe in one God and no more, and I hope for happiness beyond this life. I believe in the equality of man, and I believe that religious duties consist in doing justice, loving mercy, and endeavoring to make our fellow creatures happy. But lest it be supposed that I believe in many other things in addition to these, I shall, in the progress of this work, declare the things I do not believe. And my reasons for not believing them, I do not believe in the creed professed by the Jewish Church, by the Roman Church, by the Greek Church, by the Turkish Church, by the Protestant Church, nor by any church that I know of. My own mind is my own church." So what I read from that is that a total rejection of any particular organized religion, but certainly a belief in God. And even the language in his quote, "I believe that religious duties consist in doing justice and loving mercy." That's a quote from the Old Testament, just about. And so he might not have accepted the whole thing, but certainly we can't say definitively that he didn't get some of his very ideas from scriptures that Christians use today. So that's to say nothing the theists. So these guys are the ones that don't believe in any particular God, but they do believe in a God. They just don't think that he's all that involved necessarily. But James Madison, architect of the Constitution, we have staked the whole future of American civilization upon the capacity of each and all of us to govern ourselves according to the Ten Commandments. So now we're talking about the guys that a guy that was the architect of the Constitution, which admittedly is absent any language that puts forward a Christian message. But again, it was not intended to. But the man who was the architect behind it very much believed in being governed according to the Ten Commandments of God. And then Alexander Hamilton, this one most expressly, I think, Christian. I have a tender reliance on the mercy of the Almighty through the merits of the Lord Jesus Christ. I am a sinner. I look to him for mercy. And then his appeal is this was when he was dying. He said, "Pray for me." So Alexander Hamilton, famously in the duel that ended his life. But that's just a handful of quotes, and you can look up more. You can check me on the ones that I've used. Perhaps I've misattributed them, and I'm no expert on U.S. history. Just somebody who is interested in the truth and interested in whether or not we find out that we are founded as a Christian nation. Now, my own journey through this is I probably would have, when I was younger, I probably would have argued more vociferously for our Christian heritage, specifically Christian heritage. And I've come to soften on that because, as I said at the outset, I've actually stopped referring to any nation as a Christian nation because I see most nations are more of empire than they are of kingdom, and I use that as a distinction between the spiritual world of Christian life and practice is kingdom, because Jesus set up his kingdom on this earth, and it's a spiritual kingdom, over and against the idea of a worldly sort of system of government, which I think is important, and even the Bible talks to us about. The Bible informs us how we should treat that system of government and respect that system of government. Yet I see a vast difference between the Christian kingdom and the worldly empire. But I think it's inarguable. I think it's beyond, refutation that this nation certainly was founded upon Christian principles and Christian values. I think it's demonstrably true through the quotes that I've offered and the many more I could have offered. And I think it's really hard to get away from that when you look at those who first came over here, what motivated them to come over here, and of course, how that plays into the language of the Constitution and the realization that, hey, we don't want to repeat the errors of the past. And so while we are Christians who are founding a nation, or we are people who have come from a fairly Christian nation, founding another one, we want to avoid the same pitfalls that we're trying to exit from. So I think that's important to keep in mind. I just don't think that you can make the argument that this nation was not founded upon Christian principles. I think that's plain and obvious, and it should be to all that actually look into it with an honest desire to know the truth there. All right, next I wanted to deal with the term Christian nationalism or Christian nationalist. It seems as though every election cycle, or more often than that, but it really comes to the fore during elections or times of real political sort of fervor. And this is one of the terms. We hear this term a lot. Usually it's used by those who would not identify themselves as such. In fact, I don't know that there's many. Perhaps a few. I could think of maybe one or two right now that would not mind and maybe even voluntarily use this label for themselves. But most of the time when you hear the term Christian nationalism or Christian nationalist, it's meant as a pejorative. It's meant as an insult. So I was wondering, why is that? And, how should we see this? Should we see it as a trigger or something to be avoided? Is that labeled? Is it a dirty word? Is something that we should be, trying very hard not to be associated with. Well, just take the words and break them apart. Christian and nationalist. A Christian is someone who follows and adheres to the Christian faith and believes in that worldview. And of course, if you believe in that worldview, you should live your life accordingly. The nationalist, I had to remind myself and kind of go back and make sure that I was operating with the right definition. I think it's always important to do that. But nationalist is defined by the Encyclopedia Britannica as an ideology based on the premise that the individual's loyalty and devotion to the nation state surpass other individual or group interests. Similarly, Merriam-Webster defines it as an ideology that elevates one nation or nationality above all others and that places primary emphasis on promotion of its culture and interests. Now, neither one of those definitions, I think, particularly striking or even objectionable, right? I mean, most people are going to place their own country's interests above other countries' interests. Certainly, the organization, the governments themselves have a duty to do that. Every sovereign nation should be first and foremost looking out for its own best interest. Not that we are disinterested in what's going on in the rest of the world, the plight of people around the world. I think it's important, but I think it's their obligation, it's their duty to be first and foremost, primarily concerned with its citizenry and how they're doing and what they want, representing their people well, particularly in democratic societies, and ours being a democratic republic. So nothing particularly objectionable or I think crazy about those definitions, and those are coming from secular sources, non-Christian sources. But when you combine those terms, for some reason, when you combine those terms, you definitely are stepping into territory that most people are going to understand these things as a negative thing. Josh Howerton, whose material I've been watching more and more closely, and of course, as you watch things on YouTube and things, you're going to see more and more of it. But I've just been very impressed with him in general, and so I've shared him with a number of people in the congregation, and actually he was shared with me by somebody in the congregation. But he says this about this term. He says 99% of the time, Christian nationalism is a scare label whose subtext is, you can't advocate for your beliefs in the public square, but I can advocate for mine. He goes on to say, as John Tyson has pointed out, voting and advocating for their beliefs is what everyone in a democracy does. Everybody does this. But Christians, for some reason, are increasingly the only group in society who are shamed for doing so. Now, this is not meant to be, woe is us, victim kind of stuff. But it does, I don't mind calling it out if it seems singularly focused on one group or another. And it definitely seems singularly focused on Christians. And so I think the points stand, and I like the definition. So Christians are some of them feel obligated not to advocate for their positions, because that would be them sort of mixing faith with politics, and that's, for some reason, that's seen as a dirty thing. But the reality is that everybody advocates for their principles to be the dominant ones, the ones that for which laws are made and a society is governed. And so every single person is going to do that. We cannot separate our faith from our politics. We can't, and nor should we. Now, I used to in some ways, I want to be transparent here, and I used to in some ways be similar. Out of a desire to never conflate the idea of kingdom. So when I use the expression a kingdom, I'm talking about kingdom of God. So that which Jesus came to, initiate, that kingdom, a spiritual kingdom on this earth. I never wanted to conflate that with some hallmark version of Christian faith that you saw coming out of maybe patriotic sentiments. I always was a little bit uneasy with the idea of the cross and the flag sort of being cross being superimposed onto the flag and things like that. Because I never wanted my Christian faith to be sullied, soiled by a less, a more inferior concept of empire, right? So I use the terms kingdom and empire as sort of opposed to each other. the kingdom of God is a spiritual kingdom. It's not a power over sort of thing, but it's a coming alongside of and coming under people to lift up. And I always saw empire as sort of like the top down, power down sort of thing. And I wanted to avoid, again, conflating my idea of kingdom with empire. I wanted my loyalty to be clearly kingdom and not empire. But lately I've been somewhat convicted. I mean, lately in the last few years or more, but it's become even more heightened, I think, in the last weeks and months, as we've seen just some of the stuff going on, the assassination of Charlie Kirk and other stuff. But the conviction that I've come increasingly under is, shouldn't my kingdom loyalty, such as like to such principles as love your neighbor as yourself. So if I'm going to love my neighbor as myself, shouldn't I want the best for my neighbor? And shouldn't that mean I should want the best of what I believe the kingdom has to offer for my neighbor? And so I've become increasingly convicted that my kingdom loyalty should inform my concern for the empire, not the power structure of the empire, but the citizenry, those that are subject to the empire. And so I was thinking about this, and I should have probably come to this conclusion long before. I've long been impressed by and enamored with the history and the biography of William Wilberforce. And for those that don't know who William Wilberforce is, he was an abolitionist in England, and he was largely, if not almost singularly, responsible for toppling the slave trade in Great Britain. Now, he was not working alone. He had people, but you won't find any name more synonymous with the abolition of the slave trade in England than William Wilberforce. And I was thinking about the way that he merged his faith and politics, because early on he seemed to struggle with the separation too, and in fact he was unsure whether or not he should use his influence to go into politics and work for good there, or if his belief in God would drive him to become more a man of faith and maybe even a clergyman one day. And he goes to his, as I recall, and maybe getting the details slightly off, but as he's thinking through this, he goes to his pastor and mentor friend, John Newton. You may remember John Newton's name. He's the man who wrote the probably most famous Christian song ever, "Amazing Grace." But he goes to him and he says, I have this dilemma. I don't know what to do. Should I pursue faith or politics? And John Newton said something quite clever to him, and paraphrasing, I'm not sure what the exact quote was, but he said, I submit to you that you can do both. That your faith can be your motivation for, your inspiration for the work that you do for the nation. And so William Wilberforce would spend the next 50 years, nearly 5 decades, battling against the slave trade in England. And he eventually, when he was basically on his deathbed, he watched that be toppled, and slaves began to be freed in his lifetime. He would go on. It would be inspiration to Abraham Lincoln. In his position on emancipation. So it's interesting that we separate the two, and really maybe they're best married up together. And as I tie this back to the first section of this podcast, it was actually a bunch of Christians and religionists, because not all of them were Christians, but it was a bunch of Christians and religionists, those that at least were deists, that conceived of the very system that would protect and ensure the freedom of any and all religious expression. And as we think about that, the people that we're most afraid of now, these Christian nationalists, were the very ones that built the system that allows us to, express these things freely. I was listening to a speech, and this was years and years ago, but they used the metaphor of a boat. The people that built this big boat of freedom, and as they're finishing up the boat, they're inviting different people groups to come on, and it's the Christians that conceived this boat and built this boat, but they're like, hey, look, we don't want to limit it to us. We want this to be a freedom. We want freedom for everyone, for all religions, for all stripes, for all colors, all nations, all people. We want this to be freedom for everybody. And so as they get this boat finished up, they start inviting on more people and more people. And so little by little, you have the different denominations and different sects of the Christian faith, and then different faiths all together. And then finally, there's this group of that are not of any faith, and maybe more secularist in their view of things. And it wasn't long before, in this metaphor, the speaker goes on to say, and the last groups that were invited on began to kick off the boat, the very groups that were responsible for the freedom they enjoyed in the boat. And so when we think about all the different names that we could be called, all the different things that we could be accused of, I suppose what I would end with is this. If I were to be called a Christian for my loyalty to Jesus, I am not offended one bit. In fact, I'm proud of that. And if I was to be concerned more for my nation than for any other, again, I would not feel any guilt or shame about that. And if I were to care for that nation in a way that I think actually, in my deepest convictions of the Christian worldview, is best served by me imparting my Christian worldview onto the laws and onto the ways in which we operate as a society, isn't that the best way that I could possibly love the nation that I prioritize? I think it is. So I would say one more thing about this, and I meant to say this earlier on, but when you think about the media and you think about what's in vogue at the time and what's sort of popular right now, try to resist the urge ever to allow somebody else to tell you what you're mad at or what you're mad about, or what labels you despise or want to shame or guilt or whatever else. If it's not born out of your own convictions, chances are somebody else has planted that in your mind and you're just going along with it. And so when the next opportunity comes by for a group that we're all supposed to hate, or you're supposed to hate because you belong to one tribe or the other, just resist that. Resist that urge to go along with that until or unless you ever have actual, principled reasons for doing so. We are far too easily manipulated by things, and this is just one in many examples of it. If I'm to be called a Christian nationalist for thinking that the best thing my nation could do is follow the Lord and be loyal to Him, then call me what you will. But I won't shy away from advocating for what I think is right and true and moral and good. We've seen what the opposite. And if we looked at the opposite of Christian nationalism, what would it be? Secular globalism? I'm not going to get into that right now, but can you imagine? Is that any better? Well, maybe I will get into it for a second. You think about secular morality right now is so unhinged that it's unsure what male and female are. It's unsure what bathrooms one can use. It's unsure if a man should step into a boxing ring and beat on a woman. This is the moral landscape we are in when we hand over the responsibility to secularists to define, without any foundation, without any mooring to any scripture. This is what we have. And so again, I would say, is secularism, is secular moralism what you want? And then secular globalism, we could get into that another time. But I've already said in a previous episode, the idea of centralizing and globalizing power, I think is a real bad idea. So I'll leave it at that. Yes, our nation was founded on Christian principles. That's, I think, undeniable. Were they all Christians? Absolutely not. And we would do well not to say that they were or argue as if they were. Many of them were deists. Many of them had bad theology and really heterodox or even heretical views of things. And so we should just be honest. What does it hurt us to admit that there were some, Thomas Jefferson had some weird ideas. Benjamin Franklin probably did. Thomas Paine certainly did. But how are we harmed by just admitting that? This nation was still undoubtedly, undeniably founded upon Christian principles, and if you ask some of them, they thought even the Constitution was wholly inadequate for those that weren't tied to any sort of religious principles or convictions, because they knew that laws themselves wouldn't make a person moral. It would take something more than that, and it would take religious conviction. So that's all I got for this week. Keep your questions coming in. That's helping me to know where to go next. I do have a few ideas of my own that are kind of tabled for now. But until next time, we'll see you.